suppose. Shall we begin?
Yes, please.
ירצון מלפניך, אדוני אלוהינו, אבותינו, שלא יארע דבר קלה על ידי ולא אכשל בדבר הלכה, וישמחו בי חבריי, שלא אמר על טמא טהור ולא על טהור טמא, ולא על מותר אסור ולא על אסור מותר, ולא ייכשלו חבריי בדבר הלכה, ואשמח בהם, כי אדוני ייתן חוכמה מפיו דת ותבונה, גל עיניי והביטה נפלאות מתורתך. Coming to you live, Baruch Hashem, from Chabad Rechavia. Thank you all for joining us today. We are, Bezrat Hashem, in the middle of the 7th parak of Rambam Hilchot Yesodei Hatorah, and we quoted last time from the Moreh Nevuchim, from Rambam's guide for the Perplexed, and some questions came up about the guide and the nature of the guide. And since there are many prakim in the second book, there's a whole series of chapters starting from chapter 32 to the end of the second book that deals with the concept of prophecy, and the 7th parak of Hilchot Yesodei Hatorah deals with prophecy. So I wrote some notes up about the guide I want to share with us today, and I hope that it will be illuminating and worthwhile. So as we read this last time, right, that there are, Rambam says in the guide that there are basically 3 concepts of prophecy. There's the pagans, which is that God chooses a person and plants prophecy in this person and sends them forth into the world. And Rambam says notably that this is also what ignorant Jews believe, that the prophet is somebody that God kind of just grabs a person and shoves prophecy into their head and throws them out into the world, and they prophesy. The prophet is God's puppet.
Last week's Parsha, the last line in the Parsha talks about people like that.
Go ahead.
Remember, the last line it says,
okay,
people who
people who like sorcerers.
Sorcery,
right? Exactly, right.
But the pagans have to have a different definition of prophecy, because in Jewish prophecy, it's Hashem giving a message to the prophet. Who gives a message to the pagan prophet?
Whichever God chooses the prophet, or whichever form of God or manifestation of God chooses the prophet.
But the pagan gods are just like superhumans. They have all the human qualities, nothing to transcend humanity.
Maybe, maybe not. I mean, there are more and less sophisticated forms of non-Jewish religion, and I'm not going to go into all the detail, but I think what Rambam is pointing out, and what you're exactly hitting on, is that one of the fundamental differences between the pagan notion of prophecy and Rambam's, let's say, not just the Jewish, but Rambam's Jewish notion of prophecy, is that the difference between looking at the surface, as we just said, looking at the outside, and looking at the inner process, right? So you have 2 people, one second, you have 2 people who say, that building's going to fall down, and then the building falls down. They're both prophets, okay? One of the people kind of said it randomly, the other people has Ruach HaKodesh, and the building falls down, right? I think it's maybe a similar way to look at it is that there's a prohibition against taking a case to a non-Jewish court, even though you know you're going to get the same outcome, because in a Beit Din they're working l'shem shamayim, and they're working on a Torah-based process, and they're working to the extent that they're using their intuition. They want to be guided by Kodesh Baruch Hu. Whereas a secular court, they have law, they have precedent, and so on and so forth. So even if you get the same outcome, you didn't get the same
way.
Everything that we do, and I heard an amazing word over Shabbat, which I'm going to share now because this is the right moment. Everything that we do affects Shemayim. It's not just that God is telling us or directing things here, right? So
it's more than just predicting the future. So.
Exactly. And so Rabbi Arthur Green was with us in the Minyan, and he gave over a word from the Degel Machane Ephraim, which is words of the Baal Shem Tov, right? And he said, was it Kedoshim Tiyu Ki Kadosh Ani, right? He says, it's not just that God says, I behave a certain way, you behave a certain way, but God is saying to us, you have to behave in a holy way because your behavior affects me. Because in order to keep me Kadosh, there has to be a proper balance between Shamayim and Arith, and that's up to us. We have to behave in a holy way to sustain the holiness of God. The holiness of God like runs into a barrier when it comes down to the world, right? Which is why most people in the world are not, don't get it. Let's
Because
say.
of the animal stuff.
And I'm not so sure how much we get it, but I like to think that we're trying. Me anyway. I don't know about the rest of you. I can only talk for myself, right? I like to think I'm trying. And I think that most of the time maybe I'm not getting it, but at least it's like I may not be on the right highway, but I'm on like one of the feeder roads, and I think I'm following the right kind of the right compass point. Okay, and so if we go to a secular court, we know we're going to get the same outcome as we get in the Beit Din, but we've left behind the whole involvement with the Baruch Baruch. We left behind the whole Torah process that brings us to the decision of the secular court is correct, but it's not emet. The decision of the Beit Din, Bezrat Hashem, also has emet because it's Torah based. So similarly, the pagan prophet, maybe the prophet has like some kind of a vision and can see something, and maybe chops a little bit of the corner of the vision and sees the building fall, but it's not connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the way that Rambam is telling us the Jewish prophet, the ideal Jewish prophet, is connected. I hope that's helpful.
Well, it's a different purpose of prophecy.
But
It's the same word, but it has different, applies differently with different meaning.
By the way, magics is not fake.
What is?
Magics
Magic.
Fake.
exists,
It's reality.
and it's true.
Yes.
We are forbidden to apply to it, but it exists and it is effective. By our law, we are forbidden to apply this.
I mean, so you're saying like, why does the Torah prohibit us from going to oracles and stuff, right?
But they exist, fortune tellers.
Right.
The Greeks and the Romans, the Greeks and the Romans,
But
they were
it
very
sidetracks us from looking at this show.
on oracles.
And it focuses
They
us
weren't
on
effective.
like on a external outcome rather than a
Yes.
process.
They were
So-
violent, vicious.
So let's move forward.
That's what the magic's afforded.
Let's move forward, okay? So and Rambam said then there's the position of the philosophers, which is, and it's kind of derived from Aristotle, which there exists what's called so Aristotle talked about what we, I think, generally call excellences, right? Like each person has, almost all humans have the same capacities, but in very, very different proportions, right? So almost every human can walk and can run, but not everybody can run a 3.5-minute mile. Not everybody can run a 1 hour, 40-minute marathon. Not everybody can run 100 kilometers. Not everyone can run, okay, so the world-class athlete and I have the same physical capacities, but they have them in a very different measure, and they've also worked to develop them in a different way, right? So there exists what Rambam calls, again, deriving from Aristotle, a moral or an inner excellence known as prophetic vision. And as with all other human excellences, this quality exists in all people to a greater or lesser extent, and is also impacted by environmental forces, as are all the other human excellences, and is also developed in different ways depending on whether or not a person even is aware that they have that capacity, and then whether they work to develop that capacity or not. And the person who perfects these qualities, according to the philosophers, will become a prophet. Okay? And Rambam says the Torah view of prophecy is the same as that of the philosophers, with one huge difference, that even a person who is perfectly suited to prophecy may be denied prophecy. And the proof text he takes is from Baruch ben Neriah, who was Yirmiyahu's protege. And God says to him, you know what? You seek great things for yourself, don't seek them. And Rambam says we have like textual proof from that pasuk, from those two pasukim, that God is saying, you're ready, but you're not going to get it because it's too big a thing for you. You are not the man, as Goethe says, as Mephistopheles says to Faust in Goethe, du bist nicht der Mann. It's not going to happen to you, right? There are ranks of spiritual beings in the cosmos, and as Rambam laid out in the first 4 prakim of Yesodei Hatorah, and there are also levels of wisdom and levels of all of these, what he calls the moral excellences. And one Hacham having greater wisdom than another Chacham does not diminish the Chacham of the, call it the lower order, right? He's still a Chacham. But, so now, we began the 7th parak, and again, if you remember, like my view of this whole sefer of Yesodei Hatorah, there's 10 chapters, and the 10 chapters really map very, very nicely onto key points in the history of the Jewish people. We had the first 4 parakim, which was the creation. We had the, let me just make sure I get it right here. We had the 5th parak. Up. Come on, guys, where are we? We had the 5th parak, which took us from creation to Gan Eden, to the eating the fruit. The 6th parak, which took us to Cain and Hevel with the destruction of the name of God. And now we're in the 7th parak, which introduced the notion of prophecy as an outgrowth, if you will, of a person developing this prophetic excellence to the utmost, which is a combination, as Rambam says, of intellectual, spiritual, and imaginative faculties all being developed to their utmost. And that's Avraham Avinu. In the 8th parak, Bezrat Hashem, we're going to transition from that to Moshe Rabbeinu. The 9th parak, we go to Matan Torah. And then the 10th parak takes us into the world of Torah Shebaal Peh. So it's actually a brilliantly constructed introduction to Rambam's whole project of the Ad Chazakah, of the Mishneh Torah, because we see in this introductory work the whole purpose of Torah and mitzvot. Torah and mitzvot are to be taken on completely, and the mitzvot are to be taken on, and we must focus on them completely. But the mitzvot, even the mitzvot, are not an end in themselves. The mitzvot are like learning the grammar of God's language. And people, this comes also, like we had a whole long conversation yesterday. I was giving a shiur where people got very upset because I started talking about some of the things that we talk about in this room. So I had to detour. But, when I became observant, people said to me, "Oh, why are you doing that? You don't need to be a religious Jew to be a good person." And I said, "Of course not. That's not the issue. It's not about being a good person.
You can't be a good Jew.
That's a challenge no matter what. Always the challenge to be a good person, right? But the analogy I would say is we don't need human language in order to communicate, right? If I can't speak, I can say, right? And basically, most of my basic needs will be met. But how much more when I have a grammar and I have vocabulary and I have a language and I can actually try at least to express my thoughts and understand other people, right? So the difference between being a good person and being a good person who's striving also to be a Torah Jew is like the difference between not having a language and having a language. And the mitzvot are the grammar of the language. But the grammar, you don't learn grammar in order to sit down face-to-face with somebody and say, amo, amas, amat, amamas, amat, right? We learn grammar in order to communicate. So the mitzvot, that's our springboard to developing as Jews and as human beings and to bring HaKadosh Baruch Hu into the world. It's a huge challenge. Give up. No wonder, so many people say, I don't want to do that. But they don't get it, right? And I think my bracha for us is that we should all, get it. That we should understand that the mitzvot is something to catapult us into this higher level of relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the ability to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to influence what goes on in Shamayim and then to bring that influence down into this world and to change this world for the better and to bring the name of God into this world. And so we did the first 3 paragraphs of Hilchot, of the 7th parak. The first one is the process of training oneself to become a prophet. And again, it's very important, right? This includes, according to Rambam, focusing on the Kisei HaKavod, on the heavenly throne, if you will, on God's throne up in Shamayim, right? And what Rambam doesn't say explicitly, but it's very clear because we read the first 4 prakim, everything under the sphere of the moon is made of the 4 inert elements, right? Earth, air, fire, water, including us. Everything from the sphere of the moon and up has dat, has self-awareness, knows where it belongs on the great chain of being, and has awareness of the Creator. we, by virtue of being created from the four elements, do not have that kind of awareness, and so we have to work to maintain it. We have the ability to chop it moment by moment, right? But we can't hold on to it forever. And so, says Rambam, one of the keys to training oneself in prophecy is to strive continually to keep that channel of awareness open, the awareness of the presence of God, the awareness of where we belong in the great chain of being. Yes?
If Rambam had read the Tanya, he would have changed a bit his outlook.
How so?
How? We receive something from there, which goes beyond the four elements. Unless by Ruach, you mean also what comes from there. So we are not, maybe we are also like animals. Because he says, we are not like animals. We don't have this knowledge inside us.
Right.
According to Tanya, we do have.
So my understanding of Rambam is he's not. First of all, I think Rambam is not that far from the Baal HaTanya in many respects.
But in this aspect,
and I think what Rambam is basically saying is that there are maybe similar to the Tanya. I think what Rambam is saying is that the knowledge, God is always trying to communicate to us. The channel is always open in this direction.
with what of the four elements?
But we don't always. But no, it's the neshama. We have the soul.
Okay.
Right.
That goes beyond the four elements.
I understand, but we're not aware of it.
Okay.
Right. That's the. So I think both in Rambam and in the Tanya, I think the challenge is to be aware of that. Right. That we have the human soul, and the human soul is the receptor.
Yeah.
Right. But you have to switch it on. Right. It's like
Wi-Fi.
You know, right? Exactly. Right. Only klita. Right. I don't have a connection here. I don't have a connection here. It's like, you know, you have to switch it on.
How many of the prophets had this sustainability of awareness?
I think Moshe Rabbeinu, period.
Yeah.
I think it's only Moshe Rabbeinu. I think it's only Moshe. And
It was
Rambam,
random. To the others, it was random.
well, or yeah, I mean, I think,
Moshe Rabbeinu was constant.
and even Moshe, you know, there was the period after the spies, for 38 years he didn't receive prophecy. And actually, so Rambam explicitly addresses that as well. Let's just finish this bit first, please. So, because one comparison that I want to draw here is to the contemporary theories of mind, right? So the psychoanalyst Carl Jung, a Landsman, right?
Young was Jewish?
No, he was Swiss.
Carl Gustav Jung.
It's a Landsman of Gabriel, right? Carl Jung.
The Swiss. Who is the person?
Carl Jung.
Carl Gustav Jung.
Yeah. So
Also the German.
Swiss originally, no?
The cell.
Anyway.
Whatever.
The cell. He's speaking of the
Yeah,
cell.
that's right. So, but he said that he believed that we are always dreaming, but when we're awake, we can't connect to our dreams. It's like the stars and the moon are always in the sky, but when the sun comes out, you can't see the stars because the brightness of the sun, right? So Jung believed that there was a difference between our conscious state and our unconscious state, that when our consciousness shuts down, then the dreams connect, right? Because that's all that we see kind of on the screen of our mind, right? And I think that there's maybe a parallel to that, to the way Rambam understands prophecy, that God is sending out messages, or God's knowledge is in the world, but most of us are not capable of chopping it. So just to talk briefly about Moreh Nevuchim, the guide, and where it arose from, because the question came up like, you know, why was it written and what was its purpose? Rambam lived from 1138 to 1204. He left us 3 great works. He started his commentary on the Mishnah when he was 23 years old, and he published it when he turned 30. He, by the way, worked and revised his commentary on the Mishnah literally to the end of his life. during the years in Egypt from 1170 to 1180, he completed the Mishnah Torah, and he completed the guide for the Perplexed, the Moreh Nevuchim, around the year 1190. The Mishnah Torah, as we know, was composed in Rabbinic Hebrew, and the other works were written in Arabic and were subsequently translated into Hebrew. The guide was written basically as an extended letter to Rambam's disciple, Yosef ben Yehuda, who was a Jew living in North Africa. He was, like Rambam, a medical doctor, physician, and a rabbi. Basically the purpose of the guide was to give his disciple Yosef a step-by-step guided tour, if you will, or, a structured tour of Rambam's own project, the intellectual and spiritual pairing of Torah and Revelation with the contemporary science and philosophy and the modes of inquiry that were common in the world, in the non-Jewish world at the time. The aim of the guide, says Rambam, is to enlighten a religious man who has been trained to believe in the truth of our holy law, who conscientiously fulfills his moral and religious duties, and at the same time has been successful in philosophical studies. This work also has a second object. It seeks to explain obscure figures which occur in the prophets and are not distinctly characterized as being figures. Ignorant and superficial readers take them in a literal and not in a figurative sense. Even well-informed persons are bewildered if they understand these passages in literal significance. But they are entirely relieved of their perplexity when we explain the figurative or merely suggest that the terms are figurative. And for this reason, I've called this book a guide for the perplexed. Rambam basically divides, again, this is kind of simplistic, but he divides scriptural passages into two categories. There are those which match our clear experience of the world and are to be taken at face value because they make perfect sense. Like when we say, the king raised his hand, we all know what it looks like when a human being raises his hand. And then there are those which do not match our experience of the physical world, like when it says, and God raised his hand. And so obviously God raising God's hand in the text is not the same as a human being raising his hand in the text. And everything that does not make sense, does not match with our experience of this world, says Rambam, is to be taken metaphorically, and that there are many other lessons and many other messages to be derived from it. We shouldn't think that God has a left hand and a right hand, and God is, figure out how tall God is, and so on and so forth. So having said that, let's return B'ezrat Hashem to the fourth paragraph. Kol ha'nevi'im en mitnabim b'chol et she'yotzu. Okay, as you just said, all the prophets are not capable of prophesying any old time that they want to. Ella mechonim da'atam, but rather they concentrate their attention. Ve'yoshvim smechim v'tovim lev u'mitbodedim. As you asked last time, right? They sit and they try to get really happy and they focus. This is like you were talking about the college of prophets, right? These guys all get together in a room and they try to prophesy. And maybe it strikes one of them and maybe not. They seclude themselves and they sit there waiting for the joy to strike them. She'en ha'nevu'ah shora, lo mitoch atzavut v'lo mitoch atzilut, ela mitoch simcha. Because prophecy does not come down on somebody except if they're in a not when they're like sad or not when they're feeling kind of like bored or whatever, but only when they're in a state of joy.
Yirmiyahu was in a state of joy.
Can you imagine? לפיכך בני הנביאים לפניהם נבל וטוף וחליל וכינור. And that's why the people who wanted to be prophets, they had these musical instruments, but they had like a jazz combo playing for them all day long, right? והם מבקשים הנבואה. And then they sat there requested נבואה. וזהו שנאמר והם המתנבאים. And this is what it says in Sefer Shmuel. They were prophesying, meaning that they were doing the prophetic practice. Not that they were all prophesying, but they were chanting and singing and dancing and doing all the things to get themselves into the prophetic mood, into the prophetic states, so that one of them could actually prophesy when the time came. Ploni mitgadel. So it's like You say as like humans, people saying, "Oh, this guy is becoming great." Not that like the person actually is great, but they're doing things that they aspire to greatness. You can see that this person is doing something in order to achieve a goal that not everybody achieves. Right? As we said last time, everybody trains for the Olympics. Only one person gets the gold medal. It doesn't mean that the people who didn't get the gold medal haven't trained to their utmost. Right? But as it's the luck of the moment. אלו שהם מבקשים להתנבא הם נקראים בני הנביאים. ואף על פי שמכוונים דעתם אפשר שתשרה שכינה עליהם ואפשר שלא תשרה. And those people who aspire to nevuah, to prophecy, are called the bnei nevi'im. Okay, so we translate it as sons of prophets, but the word ben, like a bar mitzvah, doesn't mean that you're a son of mitzvah. It means that you are a person upon whom mitzvot are. So the words ben or bar or also baal which are, a son of mitzvah, a baal chesed, right? A master of loving kindness. A baal chesed doesn't mean that somebody has like this incredible, golden glowing face and a halo around their head. It means that somebody who does a lot of acts of kindness, right? It's kind of one of the beauties of the Hebrew language that we come away with this, bnei nevi'im. Bnei nevi'im are people who aspire to be prophets. Right? It doesn't necessarily mean that our ancestors are nevi'im, and it also doesn't mean that they're able to achieve nevuah. But they're people who are. That's like their involvement. They aspire to prophecy, and so they're singing and dancing, and they're going up on the mountain, and who knows what else they're doing up there. Okay, the Gemara talks about peirot diginosar, right? That there are certain fruits, certain things that grow in the ground, and if you eat them, you get really amazing visions. So,
peyotu.
Huh?
Peyotu.
For example, right?
So you're saying that prophecy is a desire or a calling?
So, I think what Rambam is saying here is that prophecy it comes from a desire to perfect oneself completely. And now there are people who figured out from watching or from reading about and studying about the prophets of the past that there are certain practices that can lead us to attaining prophecy. And so they work towards it. But again, Rambam says the big difference between us and other people's views of prophecy is we don't know which one of us, we could all have perfected ourselves, but we don't know. That doesn't necessarily mean that God is going to give all of us, or even any one of us, the actual prophetic messages. Right? And that's kind of, I think that as a larger lesson to us all, it's like we all have to perfect ourselves, Bezrat Hashem, in every way possible, through self-awareness, through cheshbon nefesh, through self-introspection, through connection to prayer and to the mitzvot, right? The purpose of prayer is not to change God, it's to change us, right? The purpose of us praying is like we pray, we say we want God to give us stuff. And Chazal tell us God will give us what's right for us. So the purpose of prayer is not for me to say, God, give me what's right for me, because we assume that God knows what's right for me. It's for me to be able to connect to what's right for me. It's to open up the channels that are blocked inside of me to receive God's unique message for me. Right? So the prophecy, this whole goal of the prophetic practices is to unblock the channels and to allow the message to come in. But again, it doesn't necessarily happen to everybody. You want to say something? Okay, the next two paragraphs are very long, and Bezrat Hashem will finish this paragraph today. כל הדברים שאמרנו הם דרך נבואה לכל הנביאים הראשונים והאחרונים. Everything that we've described above, this is all applies to both the earlier and the later prophets, חוץ ממשה רבנו, except for Moshe. He is unique. He is Rabban shel kol hanavim. He is the master of all prophets. מה ההפרש שיש בין נבואת משה לשאר כל הנביאים? And what's the difference between the prophecies of Moshe Rabbeinu and all of the other prophets? שכל הנביאים בחלום או במראה. Because all the other prophets had their visions either in dreams or in some kind of a vision. Moshe Rabbeinu מתנבא והוא ער ועומד. And Moshe Rabbeinu prophesied while he was wide awake, And he was standing up, שנאמר, ובבוא משה אל אוהל מועד לדבר איתו וישמע את הכל מדבר אליו. And when Moshe would go into the tent to speak to him, meaning to speak with God, and he heard the voice speaking to him. Right? God says, like I speak to Moshe Rabbeinu, like face to face, right? It's like I'm sitting next to you, sitting on the bar stool right next to him, and I'm telling him, Moses, like, you got to go up this mountain. I got to tell you, I'm sorry, but it's time to go up the mountain. There you go. Okay, I think I need another drink.
Did he speak to the boys, prophets, the same way like Bilam? Did he speak the same?
No, this is exactly what Rambam is saying, that the other prophecies came in some kind of like in a dream or in a vision, and Bilam is problematic. So I think Rambam, I found an interesting little note that I discovered through I found it online, but it was through one of the internet sites that I know. I don't know if you know Rabbi Gil's student, who's had a site for a blog for decades called Hilchot. And so this is something that he posted on his site a couple of years ago. It was like a scholarly article by somebody who's studying for PhD. Anyway, so he talks about Rambam, specifically talks about like what did Rambam think of Bilam? And he argues, and I think it makes sense that Bilam, and actually I wrote this out in my notes here, that that Bilam, according to Rambam's understanding of prophecy, Bilam had to be a tzaddik. So the question is, what kind of a tzaddik was he?
I thought he was a pervert.
So the question is, if he had, because Rambam says that, like he says, black and white, these are the qualifications for being a Navi. You have to have perfected yourself intellectually, morally, and imaginatively. Okay? So if Bilam is also involved in other things that we would not consider on the level of a tzaddik, what kind of a tzaddik can he be that he can receive nevuah?
Tzaddik v'ralo.
So I think, this is my own take on it, tzaddik v'ralo, I think the definition of a tzaddik is as Balatanya says, right? It's a what is it called? It's a musag mushlam. It's a borrowed term, right? So when a person does teshuvah, and they go through all the process of teshuvah, and they are genuine both in their intention and they're correct in their practice, right? Saying vidui and so on, and saying out loud what they did and so on and so forth. At that moment, they're a tzaddik. It doesn't mean that a week later, it's like trying to quit cigarettes, right? You quit smoking Wednesday morning and that's it, and you haven't touched a cigarette until Monday afternoon, and then you have a cigarette. So did you quit? You were genuine in your intention at the time, and you really tried, right? And at the same time, you weren't able to sustain it, right? So you can look at it one of two ways. You can say, "Oh, I'm a failure, I can't quit," or you can say, "Okay, I did it for 4 days. Maybe I can do it for another 4 days. Maybe I can do it for So in the moment when a person does teshuvah, in the moment when a person is exonerated or wins a case in a Beit Din, that person is tzaddik. So, and this is the example that the Balatanya brings, right? So in the moment that a person does teshuvah, maybe that's the moment that Rambam needs for Bilam to be considered tzaddik be'otosha, a tzaddik in that moment. And indeed, if you look at the text, every time Balak says to him, "Okay, go up there and curse the people," what does Bilam say? No, but before that, what does he say? He says, "Understand, I can only say the words that God tells me to say." So I want to suggest, and this is my own take on it from this article that I read, I want to suggest that maybe Rambam relies on that. That in the moment, Bilam acknowledges that God directs everything. And in that moment, Bilam is like a temporary tzaddik, to the extent that he's able to be open to receiving God's message. Bilam is kind of like, he's the prophetic equivalent of an idiot savant, right? He's like, he can do this one thing perfectly, and everything else is like a mess, right? But also part of the reason that everything else is a problem is because people don't listen to him. Balak says to him, come up here and curse these people. And he says, okay, listen, you know that I have this gift. But also, I need you to understand, I'm not going to say what you tell me to say. I'm going to say what God tells me to say. No, it's okay, fine, just curse. So, and this is, by the way, a lesson for us all, right? To pay attention to what's going on around us. That we don't always necessarily get what we want. We get what's on offer, right? That's the way life works. And we have to be very, very careful to, I would say, to fine-tune our own expectations in terms of the real world. So I hope that that's useful in terms of an understanding of how Bilam's prophecy comes about. Because Bilam is not what we would consider a righteous person.
What was he using these sacrifices for? Trying to please Hashem? What?
I have no clue. Maybe
Maybe to get in the right mood?
Yeah.
Yep. I was just trying to compare it to other prophets. I don't see him going and doing that.
they don't. Other prophets don't have to bring those sacrifices.
Yeah, Bilam is recorded in a special category, aside from other prophets. But I think what Rabbi is saying is a very important lesson for today, because Bilam was a prophet for profit. In other words, he sold himself out to a ruler to tell them what they wanted to hear within the context of what he was allowed to say. And I think what's very important is that we are in an atmosphere and an environment today where we have many of those same type of pressures upon the religious leaders that we look at for our guidance that are bending to those same kind of pressures.
Gewalt. Thank you.
Very
So doesn't he also have a touch of pagan prophecy as magic?
Bilam?
Bilam?
I think he was a psychiatric case
I can't say.
because he was changing personality.
You know what? I don't know. Not for now. I don't know.
What was it?
Because after the nevuah, Tarach kocha miyakov,
Right.
ma tovu alea, and then he sends Bal Peor or whatever. He's
No, but as Mordechai said, he was a mercenary prophet. He rented himself out he chose sides, right? Because if he had come to our side, Moshe would have said to him, okay, good, talk to the guys. And he would say, but what's in it for me? And Moshe would say, what do you mean, what's in it for you? And I think my take on it is that the big problem, Bilam's big problem was that God spoke directly to him and he didn't get it.
mm-hmm.
He said, oh, God is powerful. He didn't realize that God is God. Right.
What in this moment Nate's that he did all this? When he would curse, from what I understood, he took a split second and Hashem gets angry.
Yeah, the Gemara, yes, there's a Gemara in Brachot that talks about that. Right. It says that the miracle was that because it says that God's anger is keheref ein, like the blinking of an eye. But that the opening the gates of Bilam's prophecy was less than that. That if he had been open, an instant longer, then the anger of God would have come down and we would have been destroyed. So Bilam had like these little had these little glimpses, right? And again, as we understand, right, and this is the way the human brain works, because we live in the world of space, time, and motion. So we get an idea, but we can't express the entire idea in an instant. We can only say one word at a time. We can't say even a whole sentence at a time, much less a whole paragraph or a whole novel at a time, right? So Bilam had the flash, and then he spoke. But by the time he was speaking, the gates were closed, right? The flash came, boom! Ma tovo helech Yaakov, right? This is the prophetic process that Rambam has been describing. That a prophet gets a vision and then starts to speak, but the words that the prophet speaks are different, even with exactly the same message coming down to multiple prophets. Each one is going to prophesy differently based on their own imaginative faculty, based on how their mind works, based on their own environment, on all, their whole total situation, everything that they have lived and experienced up to that moment is going to affect the way they express themselves. And similarly, if we each take a picture, a simple picture, and we're asked to describe the picture, we're each going to use different words to describe it. Even if it's just to describe this object, right? We're each going to use different words to describe it because we all have slightly different, even around a very simple same item, we're all going to have different minds, different mental processes. So, Bezrat Hashem, let's try to finish up these
He was
paragraphs.
polluted by self-interest.
Let's try to we can talk about Bilam for hours, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, but I'd like us to try to finish this parak today because I'd rather talk about Rambam for hours than talk about Bilam for hours. Although Bilam is a fascinating topic.
No, I just try to figure out when you're talking and sharing this how he fits into all this, because he plays a big part in what we see him.
I think what I said earlier about that, aided by this one article that I found online, that I think it's maybe not the right shot, but it's certainly we can work with it. The idea that in the moment Bilam said, you know what, I can only say what God says, and God said, okay, in this moment you're at Tzaddik, let's see how long you can sustain it. I'll give you a prophetic insight, and opens his mouth. And then the next thing you know, Balak says to him, yeah, but I want you to curse him. He says, okay, let's go curse him. This guy says, you know what, I give you a chance. We're going to do this again. But over and over again, Bilam, 4 times in a row, he does this teshuvah thing. I can only say what God tells me to say. God says, I'm going to give you another chance. Which, by the way, maybe that's an even bigger message to us, right? That God will keep on giving us a chance. And how many times are we going to mess ourselves up before we destroy ourselves while God is sitting there trying to help us? Ha! Ha ha! Okay. Divine insight came to all other prophets. Every other prophet receives their prophetic insight from an angel. And that's why everything that they see in these images, they see in visions, right? Moshe Rabbeinu lo al yedei malach, but Moshe Rabbeinu did not receive his visions and his images through an angel. Pe el pe adaber bo. God says, I speak with him mouth to mouth. Nemar v'diber Hashem el Moshe panim el panim, and God spoke to Moshe face to face. V'ne'emar u'tmonat Hashem yabit, and he sees the image, the likeness of God. And all the other prophets were terrified and confounded by the revelations that they experienced, but Moshe not. It says the way that a man speaks to his buddy, right? It's like two guys hanging out together talking. כלומר, כמו שאין אדם נבהל לשמוע דבר חברו, כך היה כוח בדעתו של משה רבנו להבין דברי הנבואה, והוא עומד על עמדו שלם. So the same way that a person doesn't get like, when you're sitting there talking to somebody that you know and they say, hi, how you doing? You don't get, oh my God, I can't believe you're talking to me, right? That's the way the other Nevi'im reacted.
What does nivhal mean?
It's like astonished, right? So Moshe was not astonished. He was able to withstand, which is pretty amazing, right? God would speak with him and he would say, okay, hold on, I'm writing this down. I'm getting the message, right?
And the other Navis didn't seem to see the difference between him. I look at Miriam and Aaron. They weren't able to tell the difference between him being Navi and them being Navi. That's
why God had to explain it to them. God corrected them. Right. Exactly, right? God said, they said, well, God speaks to us too. God said, oh, you guys don't get it, right? Right. And all the other prophets were not able to prophesy anytime they wanted. Moshe Rabbeinu eno kach, but only Moshe Rabbeinu. כל זמן שיחפוץ רוח הקודש לבשתו ונבואה שורה עליו. Every time that it was necessary, that Moshe asked for it, the Ruach HaKodesh came and dwelt upon him, and he was able to prophesy.
He didn't want to prophesy.
Okay. Well, we'll get to that in a second, right? Because So Rambam actually explicitly addresses that in the guide. Okay, and therefore it says, and therefore Moshe Rabbeinu would just stand there and he would prophesy any old time. Shene'emar imdu ve'eshma'a ma yitzaveh Hashem lachem. As he says, stand there and hear what God will command to you. Meaning, any time that Moshe needed to get the message from upstairs, he had the red phone, he had the bat phone, right? It's just like pick it up, and God would tell him exactly what he had to tell all of us. Okay, and he was promised this by God, because God says, "Lech emor lahem shuvu lechem leolechem ve'ata po amod imadi." And God said to him, go tell them, go back to your tents, you stay here with me, and I will tell you exactly what to tell them.
What gave him the ability to do this? I mean, what was in him that was unique that he was able to do this? He was just picked.
There is so I have, and personally, it's my own take on it, is like, I do not, and I would say that this is a distinction that Rambam made in the guide between what he considers the pagan view of prophecy and the Torah view of prophecy. The pagan view of prophecy, and what I'm going to say may sound a little bit heretical to you, and that's okay, we can try to work it out. The pagan view of prophecy is, before the universe was created, God said, I'm going to make a man, he's going to be named Abraham Avinu. And I'm going to make him the perfect man, and from him are going to come the descendants, and they're going to be the Jewish people. And then we're going to make another man, he's going to be called Moshe, and I'm going to make him the instrument whereby the Torah will be given to the Jewish people.
This is the pagan.
I would say that's kind of like the pagan view of prophecy. And remember that Rambam, I'm not making this up, right? Rambam says, ignorant Jews also believe this. Okay? To Rambam, what Rambam calls the Torah view of prophecy, right? That there are people who work very hard on themselves and they develop a certain excellence. And even though they've developed all that excellence, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get prophecy, right? But there are things that come together. It's the right person with the right background who's done the right work, and in the right moment at the right time, and they take the right action. So the way I look at it is, the Hasidic rabbis teach us that God doesn't change, and that means that the incidents or the stories that we see in the Torah, for example, they're not something that just happened once. God does not say to Abraham, you know what, I woke up this morning and I decided it's your time, lech lecha. God is always saying, lech lecha. And for forever, since before creation, God is saying, lech lecha. That's part of what God is, right? And there was a moment, there was the right convergence of moments and people and experiences, and Abraham working hard on himself, and he came to the moment. And it's like you're walking, it's like there's a phone that's ringing, and people are walking by, and the phone's ringing, and people are walking by, and the phone's ringing, and one person comes along and says, oh, the phone's ringing, this may be important. Hello? Mm-hmm. And God says, I've been waiting since eternity for somebody to answer the phone. Now we go, right? The great Rambam scholar Menachem Kellner, one of his books about Rambam, he says, Rambam's view of like Abraham, how Abraham became Abraham, was, as I'm describing, it's the environment and the excellence that Abraham built up within himself, and then the moment, the readiness and taking the action. And he says, if Abraham, instead of being an Aramean wandering around, had been a Navajo Indian, for example, then the Torah would have been given in the Navajo language, and the cultural context of the Torah would have been the Southwest of the United States instead of the Middle East. But it so happens that Abraham was the guy in the moment in time, and he took the initiative, right? So why is Moshe unique in this sense? I would say, and again, I don't know, but from my own study, you see Moshe's story, you see that he is uniquely suited to be a leader of just in that time and place of those people, because he is of both peoples and yet of neither, right? He is the Hebrew who grows up, he learns Hebrew from his natural mother, and then he's raised as a prince in Pharaoh's palace, but he's not really, it's like the eternal story of the Jews. Yeah, but Blut bleibt Blut. You're still not one of us, right? Your blood, you have Hebrew blood in you. Okay. And so he's an insider and an outsider on both sides, right? And because he is he is among both, but really kind of neither. He's capable of, he's the interface, right? And this is I learned from my Rabbi, David Silber, who's, you see, when does God remember us in Mitzrayim? God remembers us after Moshe has his sons, right? And he says, I'm a stranger in a strange land, and I'm trying to remember all of the point is that Moshe enters into a phase of kind of remembering where he came from, and so again, it's kind of like it's the convergence of a huge number of streams coming together at the right moment at the right time, and Moshe is the right person at the right time. And by the way, being chosen doesn't necessarily mean you want to be chosen. And here's like a big lesson, right? Moshe is at the sneh, at the bush, and he goes and God says to him, "Oh, great, I have a job for you. I want you to go to Mitzrayim and talk to Paro." He says, "What, are you kidding me? Ixnay on that. I'm not going to do that." No, God says, "No. You're the right guy for the job." Moshe says, "I don't want to do it." God says, "I want you to do it." He says, "I don't care. You want me to do it, right?" So, like, the whole process of being chosen starts right there. If we're the chosen people, we're chosen just like Moshe is chosen. This is a big responsibility. It's not necessarily that somebody in their right mind would want to do, right? But Moshe finally, as Hamlet says, the readiness is all. And when the moment comes, he says, under duress, he says, "Okay, I'll do it." And by the way, going back to the Gemara in Brachot, it says, Moshe was supposed to be both the king and the Kohen Gadol.
Yeah.
And why was he not the Kohen Gadol? Why was he only the political leader? Right. God says to him, when I was ready, you weren't ready. Now you want? I don't want anymore. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll give it to your brother. Right? Separation of church and state.
I wonder how Yitro played into all this. He was a brilliant.
And so when the prophecy departs from all the other prophets, they quote unquote return to their tents, which means that they go back into the day-to-day life. And literally, as we have from the Midrash, the way it describes it, that they go back to their wives. And this is why Moshe Rabbeinu separated himself from his wife forever, because he had to retain this state of, it's more than just ritual purity. It's that he had to withdraw from the physical aspect to the extent possible in order to stay open to the spiritual side, to receive the prophecy.
He didn't have enough time for both.
הנביא אפשר שתהיה נבואתו לעצמו בלבד, להרחיב ליבו ולהוסיף דעתו, עד שידע מה שלא היה יודע מאותן הדברים הגדולים. So it's also possible that the prophet experiences a prophecy for his own sake. In other words, to open up his mind and to increase his knowledge so that he knows something more than, so that he's able to understand and know something he didn't know before. And it's possible that he will be sent to one of the other nations of the world or to the inhabitants of a particular city to prepare them and to inform them what they should do or to prevent them from continuing the evil that they are doing. And כשמשלחים אותו נותנים לו אות ומופת כדי שידעו העם שהאל שלחו באמת. And when they're sent to this prophecy to to a foreign nation or whatever, they're given these special signs so that the people right away know that God sent them. This is a little bit contradictory because who's the big contradictory example here? Is Yonah, right? Why does Yonah say, "I don't want to go"? I think the reason Yonah says, "I don't want to go" is he says, "God, it's like you pulled this trick on me once before, right? I'm going to go there and I'm going to say, oh, repent, and they're going to say, okay." That's what happens. He gets to Nineveh, he says, "Repent." Okay, fine. Right away. He says, "God, I had to go through all this to come here." Everything. Okay. Right. You could have just dropped a note.
Right? He also was worried how it was going to make Israel look.
Not everyone who performs signs or wonders should be accepted as a prophet. Only a person who is known to be fit for prophecy. Wisdom, good deeds surpass all those of his contemporaries. And so this is a very important point halachically. If he follows the path of prophecy and holiness and separates himself from worldly matters and performs a sign or a wonder and states that he was sent by God, it's a mitzvah to listen to him.
I have a difficult question.
It's possible that a person will perform a sign or a wonder even though he's not a prophet. But the wonder might have another cause behind it. As you said, there is chishef, there's magic, right? It is still a mitzvah to listen to them. If he's a wise man of stature and fit for prophecy, we accept his prophecy as true, right? In other words, there are halachic standards whereby a person is going to be considered a prophet until and unless proven otherwise. Aha! So what's the example? For example, he says, כמו שנצטווינו לחתוך את הדין על פי שני עדים כשרים. We are commanded to make a judgment in Beit Din on the basis of two kosher witnesses, right? אף על פי שאפשר שהעידו בשקר, they might be lying, right? So what do we know about the Edei Sheker, about Edem Zomemim, the notion of Edem Zomemim, right? We know that it's like two people come to Beit Din and they say, I saw you commit murder on this street corner over here in front of the great synagogue last Thursday, and then a third person comes in and says, wait a minute, you couldn't have seen him there last Thursday because last Thursday you were with me in the Galil, right? So now the Edem Zomemim, if no other person had come to mizamem them to undercut their testimony, the person would be judged guilty of murder. Now, two other witnesses come and they say, no, you couldn't have seen that because you were with us in the Galil. Those witnesses are believed, chalas, it's finished. They may be lying, but the halachic process stops there. You have to draw a line somewhere, right? So this is this is critical. Rambam is saying to us, we have the Torah, we have revelation, but we don't know everything. We do not have this divine omnipotence, and God is not necessarily going to tell us every moment, right? So we have to figure out how to deal with this. A person comes along and they're wise and they're moral and they're superior in every respect, and then they do a sign and a wonder and then they prophesy, we accept them as a prophet, right? Considering all these matters and the like, it says in Sefer Devarim, נסתרים להשם אלוקינו והנגלעות לנו ולבנינו, ונאמר כי האדם יראה לעיניים והשם יראה ללבב. Because man sees what is revealed to the eyes and God sees into the heart. And so Rambam leaves us with an amazingly important concept, which is that there's all this great stuff going on, and God is talking to people, and people are prophesying, and Moshe is telling us what to do, and we are now left high and dry. All that we have is we have the Torah, we have the wisdom that we have tried to learn from those who came before us, and we have our own common sense, and we have the acceptance of the halachic process. And the halachic process that's like what keeps us on track. Okay, so we said at the beginning, like the mitzvot are absolutely critical, and we have to pay very careful attention and focus very closely on the mitzvot. But the mitzvot are not the end of what's required of us. They are the springboard for us, Bezrat Hashem, to achieve greatness as individuals, as a community, as a nation, and as a part of the community of all humanity, to bring God into this world. Okay, so we need to pay careful attention to every step of the way. But there's like a disconnect. When we were in the Midbar, it was great. We were wandering around. We had nothing to distract us. And Moshe, every time there's a question, we go to Moshe and he would say, okay, fine. Now, the 38 years, we're going to end with this, the 38 years that Moshe did not receive prophecy, Rambam says in the Nebuchim that the reason he didn't receive prophecy is the prophecy only comes to someone who's in a state of joy. And that after the episode of the Meraglim, after the spies, Moshe was so depressed for 38 years that he could not unclog the channels to receive the prophecy. Okay, but I want to suggest something else. That those 38 years, that's 2 generations, that was our time. When Moshe's prophecy returns, it's a signal to him that he's entering now the end stage of his life, of his project. Right? It's a signal to us that it's time for us to take over and move forward. And we have to move forward on our own. We have to move forward with the halacha and the traditions and our learning to guide us. We don't have Moshe to guide us anymore. And that was the lesson we had to learn in those 38 years. How do we manage a functioning society without prophecy, without a great leader to tell us every step of the way what to do? How do we mitmoded ourselves? How do we make it happen for ourselves? So my bracha for all of us is that we should never lose sight of that, and that we should succeed at it, B'ezras Hashem, but also that we should have enough rachmanis and enough mercifulness and understanding for ourselves. We just read, V'ahavta l're'acha kamocha, right? That we always give ourselves a free pass, right? And we need to sometimes be a little bit kind of towards one another. We also need to understand that we're all doing the best that we can, and rather than judging each other, we should reach out and help each other. If we see somebody doing something that we think is wrong, first of all, we might not understand what they're actually doing. So instead of judging them and say, oh, that's terrible what they're doing, say, hey, explain to me about this. I'm interested, okay? You might learn something. They might learn something. They're not going to learn anything if you say to them, that's treif! But we might all learn something if we say, teach me.
So the Muslim is saying that Allah is the greatest prophet is like the Christians saying that Jesus is Mashiach.
But except the Muslims say that Jesus is the prophet also.
So what was
But they're
the...
saying that Allah is the last great prophet.
Yeah.
So there's a... I never saw that connection before. Just throwing
Okay. Yeah. No, it's, replacement.
That's why they're both wrong.
What was the
replacement.
halachic wrongdoing of Yeshua?
Oh, that's a good question.
He was considered a prophet.
Baruch Adonai L'olam, amen, amen.